Okay, let's get going. It's about 3 o'clock. Welcome, everybody. Herzlich willkommen. Thank you for joining us today. I warmly welcome you to our roundtable entitled How to Strengthen Evidence-Based Policymaking, Strategic Positioning Within Government. This online meeting is hosted by the Initiative for Evidence-Based Policymaking of the German National Academy of Sciences, Leopoldina. My name is Regina Rippan, and I will be chairing today's event. I am Vice President of Leopoldina and Professor for Empirical Economics at Friedrich Alexander University in Erlangen-Nuremberg. Jointly with Professor Monika Schnitzer, I run the Initiative for Evidence-Based Policymaking of Leopoldina. This initiative offers a dialogue and networking platform with and for stakeholders in politics and academia. It aims at supporting evidence-based policymaking, and it addresses the empirical foundations of policy decisions. With our roundtable event series, we pursue an international perspective and discuss best practices, as well as challenges of evidence-based policymaking across national governments. We take account of promising initiatives in politics and administration that apply findings based on science. And we direct attention to such initiatives. Some of you might have been present at our last event on international best practice and evidence-based policymaking in February last year. For those of you who are curious about the results, there will be an event documentation about the past as well as this present event available by the end of the year. With that said, welcome to our speakers who join us today from Canada, the United Kingdom, Belgium, and from the German political administration. Thank you so much for accepting our invitation. Warm greetings as well to the many participants from the federal government in Germany, national and international administration, from scientific institutions, and to all who signed up. Let me explain our objectives for this workshop. Scientific analysis cannot replace political decision-making, but they can provide the basis for better informed decisions, provided they are introduced at the right time. In consequence, for politics and science to cooperate effectively, appropriate structures are needed. Today, we are looking at ways to improve such structures for evidence-based policymaking within governments. We hope to spark ideas and to showcase existing initiatives in Germany and around the globe. Today, we are honored to learn about the work of Mona Nehmer, the Canadian Chief Science Advisor, Miriam Stirnol, who is Senior Evaluation Officer of the British Evaluation Task Force, and Kai Hilscher, who represents the German regulatory Sandboxes unit at the Federal Economic Affairs Ministry, where he is head of the coordinating office. Our fourth speaker today is Jeromine Zettelmeier. Jeromine is a former government official and now director of the think tank Bruegel. He will provide analytical support in answering the question of how to strengthen evidence-based policymaking. Also, in terms of the German project, he can provide a wider perspective on its reasons for success. All initiatives chosen for today are relatively new and have been initiated recently. We are particularly interested in their founding history, their genesis, and their unique qualities for better lawmaking. The Canadian Post and the UK unit serve to stimulate the discussion on whether these international best practices could be applied as role models within the German government, whereas the German unit stands for an innovative path that has already been implemented. Thank you all for sharing your knowledge and experience with us today. The plan for the workshop is that we first go in 4 rounds to each of our presenters. I will briefly introduce the experts, then we hear short presentations and can ask immediate questions of understanding. After the 4 rounds, we have time for a general discussion. You are very much invited to contribute your questions then. So before we get started, some technical matters. Please mute your microphones throughout the event. Please note that we are video recording the speakers of this session. The video will be posted on Leopoldina's website and YouTube channel. The audience will not be part of the visual recording, but your voice can be heard if you submit a question verbally. You can submit a question or name a theme via the chat, and you can send a message directly to me, Regina Ripan. Particularly if you prefer to stay anonymous, you can just say that in the chat and I will just read the question. Please also raise the little virtual hand so I remember you submitted a question. Please stay muted until your turn is to take the question, and I will call your name. Up for the speakers, as we have put together a dense program of just over 90 minutes, a clock will pop up 2 minutes before your speaking time ends, just for information. Okay, let me introduce our first speaker for today, Mona Nema. We are particularly honored to welcome the Canadian Chief Science Advisor to our roundtable. Mona is a chemist by training with an outstanding expertise in the field of molecular cardiology. She was professor of pharmacology at the Université de Montréal and directed the cardiac genetics unit at the Montreal Clinical Research Institute. Prior to her first appointment as Chief Science Advisor in 2017, she was a professor and vice president of research at the University of Ottawa. Mona has served on various national and international advisory committees and boards and is the recipient of many national and international honors. She is a fellow of the Canadian and American Academy of Sciences. Mona has been reappointed as Chief Science Advisor 2 times, 2020 and 2022. During her mandate, she has helped to expand and diversify science advice to government and has also promoted the free, open, and responsible use of science in those structures. We are looking forward to learn more about her governmental activities. Dear Mona, the floor is yours. You have to unmute yourself, please.
Okay, is this better?
That's better.
Very sorry. Guten Tag und vielen Dank für die Einladung zu diesem Roundtable. Congratulations to Leopoldina for this brilliant idea, actually, to have the roundtables on evidence-based policy making across national governments. And it's a privilege to be here with you today. As Canada's Chief Science Advisor, my role is to provide science advice to the Prime Minister and Cabinet. And I thought that today I'll give you an idea of the type of work that I have done over the past 5 years, but also a bit of the history, the genesis of my position. So my office makes recommendations to ensure that science is considered in government decisions, and we coordinate expert advice to Cabinet. I also provide recommendations on how government can better support quality scientific research and make it fully available to the public. Lastly, it is also my role to promote collaboration between scientists, both in Canada and abroad, and work to raise public awareness of science. And that's a role that I particularly assumed, of course, during the pandemic. The current position of Chief Science Advisor was created, as mentioned, in 2017, after a federal election where science exceptionally actually took center stage. Up to 2015 federal election, science and science advice had not been prominent platform commitments of any major political party in Canada. And this change was likely the result, at least in part, to mounting criticism that the governing party of the day was not using science in its decisions. In fact, in 2012, hundreds of people, including many scientists, held a mock funeral on Parliament Hill to mourn what they called the death of evidence and the muzzling of scientists by the federal government. And there was a 10-year anniversary just a few weeks ago of this event. As a response to this public concern, a number of electoral platforms proposed the creation of a science advisor position in one form or the other. And after the election, the Minister of Science was asked to create a Chief Science Officer mandated to ensure that government science is fully available to the public, that scientists are able to speak freely about their work, and that scientific analyses are considered when the government makes decisions. The minister considered a number of international models, among them those in the UK and New Zealand. She then launched an open, transparent, and merit-based selection process. And this process concluded with the announcement by the Prime Minister on September 26, 2017, of my appointment as Canada's Chief Science Advisor. Since my appointment 5 years ago, my office has significantly contributed to all facets of our mandate, which, by the way, was easier said than done. And I'm happy to answer questions around that. So we contributed to all facets of our mandate, highlighting the importance of the role both in peacetime and, of course, during a national emergency, as in the past 2.5 years. So this includes the development of a model scientific integrity policy, which has been adopted by all federal ministries employing scientists. The publication of a roadmap for open science, not only to the federal government scientists, but to the country, which provides common principles and timelines for advancing open science practices in Canada. The establishment, operation, and growth of a network of departmental science advisors. So these are science advisors in each of the ministries to further enhance science advice across government. And the foresight that we had to run a simulation exercise with our colleagues from the UK and the US for science advice in an emergency, which we did in June 2019. And this proved to be invaluable over the past 2 years in actually providing advice during an emergency. Providing science advice to government involves bringing together diverse disciplinary perspectives on an issue, synthesizing the most relevant and up-to-date understanding, and communicating this understanding at the right time and in a meaningful way to decision makers. I'll speak more specifically to 3 examples that illustrate the diverse forms that my advice to government can have. The first one is providing advice to the Minister of Fisheries and Oceans on the appropriate use of science in aquaculture decision-making. For this, I established a 12-member independent international multidisciplinary expert panel on aquaculture, which released a public report containing 10 specific recommendations. As I think people realize, aquaculture was far from my field, and my job as a chair was actually to ask the tough questions and really get the different sides of the question to provide their arguments, to provide their references for their positions, and to synthesize all this. The second example relates to the management of federal government-supported major research facilities across the country. After Budget 2018 announced support for national science facilities like cyclotrons, icebreakers, genome centers, I was asked by the Prime Minister to provide advice on the long-standing issue of the sustainable management of major science facilities in Canada. Following targeted consultations that included national and international experts and leaders of similar facilities, I recommended the adoption of a strategic national portfolio approach. This recommendation was communicated to the Prime Minister and the Minister of Science, and subsequently, I included it in my annual report. The third example relates to science advice during COVID. As the COVID-19 pandemic took hold in Canada, I proactively set up a number of pathways that brought scientists together and allowed information to flow swiftly from Canada's most knowledgeable researchers through to government decision makers. Our efforts were successful thanks to the willingness participation of the scientific community across Canada. In addition to that, by taking part in numerous government task forces, example, the vaccine task force that I recommended to government, the immunity task force, more recently, the biomanufacturing strategy, I was also able to offer a whole of government perspective and help coordinate advice to the Prime Minister and his cabinet. In this case, a mix of formal reports, direct advice, official recommendations, and science notes served as means of communicating the science and the science advice to policymakers during a national emergency. This and other work from my office benefits the Canadian government, and for that matter, Canadians, in multiple ways. Because the Chief Science Advisor is positioned outside of the departmental silos, it can provide a friendly challenge function to departments and an independent, objective perspective to government. It can also play an important convening role, enabling a whole of government approach when issues impact more than one department, which often happens, and in fact is happening more and more. A Chief Science Advisor can also benefit the government on the international scene. I have acted as actually an effective representative and country coordinator in relevant scientific forums, especially during the COVID pandemic, when science advisors and their equivalents from several countries met regularly to share data, exchange best practices, and all this in real time. Several countries that didn't have a Chief Science Advisor or equivalent either missed out on the meetings or had difficulty ensuring the necessary continuity because different representatives attended different meetings depending on the main topic to be discussed. In my experience, to be effective, a Chief Science Advisor must enjoy the respect and trust of the general public and the scientific community, as well as that of policymakers, namely government leaders and senior civil servants alike. Practically speaking, having an accomplished scientist in the role of science advisor represents a good start. Building constructive relationships and effective networks is instrumental for maximizing the benefits of the role. Last but not least, clarity in communication, honesty, and integrity are essential for building and maintaining trust. In conclusion, assuming the role of Chief Science Advisor is a great privilege that must be conducted with humility and altruism, with the objective of ensuring that science can benefit society as a whole. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share my experience so far, and happy to elaborate during the question period.
Thank you very much, Mona. This is very impressive. Thank you for your report. We do have 2 minutes for brief questions. I'm sure we have a lot of questions for question and answering. Is there anything in terms of content that needs to be clarified right now? I don't see anything in the chat. Maybe one brief question, if you allow. How about conflict? If you do COVID in Germany, anything you would recommend would generate conflict. How did this work in Canada?
There was some conflict later on. You know, early on in the pandemic. Actually, when I spoke publicly very, very often, but I never spoke to the policies that the government was making. I spoke to the science and to knowns and unknowns, and how do we need to go about finding out more about the virus to be able to manage it. So and of course, journalists always try to provide provocative questions so that I either agree or disagree with the government policies. But I think they very quickly realized that I will not answer these questions. And very exceptionally, I would make comments about, for example, border measures that need to be adapted to the situation, but sort of general principles and not specific policy directions.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. We have one question in the chat. Ayan, do you? I can read it. The chat question says, as a Canadian myself, I also read about how the previous government under Prime Minister Harper muzzled scientists. What safeguards, if any, are in place now to ensure that scientists can speak freely, regardless of who is in government? Is this a short thing to answer?
I think that the scientific integrity policy was really a very important development, because now it's enshrined actually in the collective agreement, in the contract of the civil servants, of the scientists. So it provides clarity around the responsibility of the employer, that is the government, and also the employees, that is the scientists. So there is something that is both morally and in a way also legally binding to both parties right now.
Okay, thank you very much for these additions. Then I will now move to our second speaker. We are going to learn about the activities of the British Evaluation Task Force, presented by Miriam Stiernol. Miriam is a senior evaluation advisor in the Evaluation Task Force. This is a joint unit set up by the Cabinet Office and Her Majesty's, is it still her? Treasury, it's by the Treasury. Its task is to change how the UK government evaluates its policies and programs. Miriam holds a master's in quantitative research methods from the London School of Economics and a postgraduate degree in public policy from the University College London. She has run randomized controlled trial and quasi-experimental evaluations to address the growing need for high-quality causal evidence that shows what works in public services. Prior to joining the UK Civil Service, Miriam was an evaluation associate in the Policy Institute at King's College London and served as evaluation manager for TASO, the What Works Center for Higher Education. We are happy to have you here, dear Miriam. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much. And I also apologize in advance if I misspoke and still say Her Majesty's government. It is now officially His Majesty's government, but we're all still learning that. I've got a presentation to share, so hopefully everybody can see my screen now. Can I just check that that's the case?
Yes, I can see it, yeah.
Brilliant. So yeah, thank you very much for having me speak today. As I already mentioned, my name is Miriam Stiernol and I work in the Evaluation Task Force. So I'll really briefly talk to you about the task force, a bit about the history and the barriers and hindrances that kind of led to our setup, and then what we are set up to do and hopefully what we aim to achieve in the UK government over the next 3 to 5 years. So as a brief introduction, the ETF, abbreviation for Evaluation Task Force, aims to improve people's life by ensuring that robust evidence on the effectiveness of policies and programs sit at the heart of spending and operational decisions across government. So as Mona already said, what we're really trying to do is to apply the methods of evaluation and experimentations that are very common in fields like medicine to the approximately £1 trillion that the government spends every year on public services. And coming back to Mona's example on COVID, we would never consider rolling out a vaccine that had not been rigorously tested, yet we continuously roll out policies in education, social welfare, and other public services without truly understanding whether they work and without having a right system in place to measure their effectiveness. So the ETF is trying to change that in the UK government. Our work splits into 3 key areas. First of all, we drive continuous improvements in the way government programs are evaluated. So we work very closely with the Treasury and we inform Treasury and spending teams on emerging evidence and the robustness of evidence that can then inform evidence-led decisions on whether business cases or follow-up, scale-up cases should get stopped, continued, scaled up, or modified. Next, we support departments and departmental analysts and policymakers to conduct program evaluations that are robust and that are proportionate. What that means is that we are trying to drive, as I said earlier, more of that causal evidence, that we really want to find out if program A leads to outcome B. But also an RCT is not appropriate for every kind of policy. So we also want to make sure that evaluation is proportionate to the policy that needs to be evaluated and assessed, and that budget and resources are accordingly distributed across the portfolios of programs. And then lastly, we want to empower departmental analysts. So what that means is that we want to make sure that the way that government does policy is not a silo between the analysts and the scientists on one side and the policy profession on the other. We want to get those two sides talking to each other and make sure that all policy designs and spending decisions, operational decisions are really affected, not only like how things get evaluated, because obviously implementation of a policy has a knock-on effect on what kind of evaluation you can do, but also how evaluation results are then being used for follow-up implementation. Going on a bit of a history tour before we start talking about 2022, I very briefly want to go back to the year 2010. So the back then Prime Minister, David Cameron, promised a step change in how government will use data and evidence to inform how we do policies. That basically got inspired by the book Nudge by Thaler and Sunstein, and he concurrently set up the so-called Nudge Unit, which became the Behavioral Insights team. So the Nudge Unit marked the first top-level push for a central team of experts to provide robust trialing and evaluation advice to government activities. For us in the UK, that meant from 2010 onwards, there was a central debate on how we can apply these techniques of evaluating behavioral insights to the wider social policy sphere, and to slowly overcome a bit of a perceived pushback and barrier that social policies cannot be evaluated because it's either unethical to randomize a policy or that it's just too complex to do that. So that's 10 years ago. What's the state of the evidence today? Unfortunately, 10 years on, that kind of robust evaluation is still at the margin of policy making. Indeed, in 2020, the Prime Minister's Implementation Unit did an audit of major projects, so the key government projects that need to be achieved to achieve the Prime Minister's big goal, political goals. It turns out that only 8%, so approximately 400 billion pounds, that only 8% of these government projects had a robust evaluation plan in place. That meant that 400 billion pounds that we spend each year, and that's not legacy projects, that's new projects, have no robust evaluation plan in place. So we have no idea whether these policies are actually achieving what they're meant to achieve. To put it more crass, that's about £12,000 each year for each UK taxpayer on things that we don't know are actually working or not. So despite the strong push 10 years ago, we're still not really getting the neck of like how to embed evaluation into policy design, which is now fast forward 10 years to the Spending Review 2020, where back then Chancellor Rishi Sunak announced the Evaluation Task Force. And the idea behind it was that we've got a task force that sits both in the center of government, similar to the Nudge Unit, but that is also connected to Treasury, so that we've got real levers and that we can actually make sure that evaluation discussions are included in spending review processes. So the ETF advises by giving RAG ratings, RAG stands for red, amber, and green ratings, on business cases as part of the spending reviews, but also other crucial policy documents, such as the operational delivery plans, which are annual plans that departments have to submit where they line out how they're going to implement and achieve their key goals. So the ETF becomes involved in all of these decisions and makes sure that robust evaluation plans are in place for key business cases and ODPs. We also promote, as I said earlier, government social research profession. So what I mean by this is that we make sure that any kind of discussion that we have with departments on new or existing policies includes analysts in the room, so that we can ensure that robust evaluation plans are discussed and raised at the right moment, ideally at the beginning of a policy design phase, so that mechanisms and data collation infrastructure is set up to really ensure the best kind of evaluation. What it also allows us to do is to make sure that appropriate budgets and resources for evaluation are integrated both in the business cases, but also are cross-checked with actual analysts in the department. And then thirdly, we conduct training, not just training of junior ministers, but also of senior civil servants. And Mona mentioned it a bit before. It is really important to have the buy-in and to raise awareness from these key stakeholders to ensure that they promote and they push for the evaluation agenda. So we are running integrated training modules on evaluation literacy in the core curriculum for new junior ministers. And we have an objective on evaluation in the annual performance review for senior civil servants now. Exciting news, we're actually trialing the training for ministers as a waitlist to RCT at the moment with a new trust government, and it's inspired by an RCT that ran in Afghanistan on training ministers in econometrics. On the bottom left side, we also ensure access to evaluation capability. Obviously, the civil service needs to raise its capability in and by itself, but we also want to make sure that there is a connection to external experts. So the evaluation task force is a secretariat for What Works networks, which is 14 independent centers in the UK that collate, generate, and translate evidence in key policy areas. And the ETF makes sure that there is a connection between departmental long-term plans and the What Works Center portfolio. But we also run something called the Evaluation and Trial Advice Panel. And that's a panel where any civil servant can submit a project, and then a panel gets convened that consists of external academic experts and evaluation specialists within the civil service that discuss that proposal and discuss what is a feasible and proportionate evaluation approach for that proposal. We don't just demand new evidence, we're also funding for new evidence to be generated. So we got funded 50 million in the last spending review to launch an evaluation accelerator fund. The fund was set up to accelerate evaluation activity and to create actionable evidence in government priority areas to inform decision-making at the next spending review. And that includes evaluations that include RCTs, quasi-experimental designs using administrative data, etc. And then lastly, we really want to ensure that there's transparency and accountability throughout. What that means is that we're launching an evaluation registry onto which each department needs to submit their evaluation plans, trial protocols, and subsequent evaluation findings. And what we want to make sure here is that lessons are being learned, and people that want to establish new policies can look up what lessons and what findings have already been established, but we also want to establish the accountability. Scientific analysis is crucial in all of this because we need robust analyses to understand what works and what doesn't. And as I said earlier, especially in times like these, like, is it value for money? Is that the best way we can spend public spending? And academic theory is grounded in how we do that kind of policy evaluation throughout. So before an implementation, we use evidence reviews and theories of change to really help the design of policies and test the logical chain. Appraisals look at value for money and additionality. The monitoring and evaluation stage aligns to the Maryland Scientific Method Scale, where we really encourage departments to think about what method is appropriate for their context and how ambitious can they do. What kind of findings can they establish? And the feedback then, as I mentioned earlier, the registry really encourages transparency and replication of these findings. So lastly, how do we intend to influence wider government? We've got 3 major goals, which are actually really straightforward, but very complex. We want government departments to design and deliver robust and proportionate evaluation across their portfolio. We want government departments to have a transparent approach to their activities where things and findings are published early and replicably. And lastly, we want good quality evaluation to inform decision-making in government as a result of the former 2. That's the end of my slide. If you've got any further questions, please feel free to visit us online or to send us an email at etf@cabinetoffice.gov.uk.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Miriam. Get a virtual round of applause. And we have again take 2 minutes for short questions, maybe one brief questions. That the initiative by Mr. Sunak was started when? How long ago was it?
So it was announced in the spending review 2020, but the team only got established at the beginning of 2021.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah, it's rather recent, yeah. Are there any other immediate short questions for understanding this? Doesn't seem to be the case. Then thank you. And we move on to our third speaker. We are turning to a promising path taken in German government, the regulatory sandboxes at the Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs and Climate Action. The head of the coordinating office, Kai Hilscher, walks us through this innovative way of lawmaking. Kai has been a senior economist at the Federal Ministry since 2011, and he is holding a PhD in economics from Helmut Schmidt University in Hamburg. Kai strongly promotes evidence-based policymaking within the ministry. He has cooperated with Jeromin Zettelmeier on this issue during Jeromin's time in the ministry. Currently, Kai is leading the coordinating office on regulatory sandboxes, which has been set up in 2019. He has pushed the idea of sandboxes as an important new instrument of evidence-based policymaking from the start. Together with the team of the coordinating office, he is now in charge of drafting a general regulatory sandbox law as called for in the existing coalition agreement. So Kai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for inviting me to discuss evidence-based policy initiatives in this high-level group. And I apologize for technical problems, so I'm pretty far from the camera. I hope you can apologize that. So I can well remember that we sat together with Leopoldina several years ago to discuss evidence-based policy making in Germany. And we took many interesting points from that discussion in our daily activities in the ministry, and also developed new ideas. And I'm therefore very pleased to present you today an initiative on regulatory sandboxes that is getting increasingly important, not only on a national, also on a European level, especially, and that's on regulatory sandboxes, and as we call them in German, Reallabore. So I have a brief presentation which I'd like to share. So I hope you can see the presentation. Is that correct? Okay, perfect. And our initiative at the economics ministry was developed in a very small scale specialist level, so bottom up, so to speak. And we had a small workshop already in end of 2016 at the ministry, and then we tried to make the broadest possible use of the expertise within the ministry, and we developed in cross-departmental working group to take knowledge on board. And this working group set up a strategy which we are now implementing within the coordinating office. And on the way, we always sought to the exchange with the scientific community also. So I want to start out by briefly describing what regulatory sandboxes are and how they contribute to evidence-based policy and regulatory learning in general. And then I want to give, in a brief nutshell, an overview on what we do and what we plan. So what are regulatory sandboxes about? You can see a lot of small pictures on there. Those are regulatory sandboxes that were conducted in Germany already, many of them. And I will give a concrete example in a second, but I would ask a question first. What are the goals of regulatory sandboxes? So first, the idea arose from the question, how can we test digital innovation, or how can we improve the test of digital innovations in Germany, and how to bring them to the market more quickly? And an important question is also how we as a regulator can keep up with the pace of digitization and adapt regulation quickly. So whereas in the Anglo-Saxon world, the approach is more like, go ahead, try, and if you fail, then you're liable. In Germany, the approach is more cautious. So usually we wait until we're very sure that something will work out, and then we'll allow it. So regulatory sandboxes are supposed to be something in between, like an Anglo-Saxon approach and the German way of doing it. So regulatory sandboxes are first about enabling innovation. So sandboxes offer the opportunity to test new ideas in the real world for a limited time. And those are innovations which are often not compliant with the general legal framework. So what we need is legal leeway in the legal framework to be able to test, and this is given by experimentation clauses. The second goal is that by testing in a real-world environment, we generate evidence about the impact of innovations, for example, on society, the economy, and the environment. And this will then help us to adapt the legal framework quickly and find a good balance between what we call innovation friendliness and also the consideration of a wide range of protected interests. So I want to, I've brought some citations. We have also brought the issue on the European level during the German presidency in 2020, and that's citations from the conclusions of the Council of the European Union regarding regulatory sandboxes. And this showed, those citations show that the importance and the general agreement of the 27 member states that regulatory sandboxes are an important instrument for evidence-based policy. So flexibility and experimentation sandboxes are important part of evidence-based policy. They are important for many fields of innovation and technology areas. So it's cross innovation instrument, and also experimentation clauses in laws provide the legal basis and the legal leeway that is necessary for conducting sandboxes. And most importantly, from my point of view, is that regulatory sandboxes can really provide the evidence to do proactive regulatory learning. One example from Germany, there was a test of driverless on-demand shuttles in Osnabrück. It was called Hub Chain, to connect rural regions to urban public transport. And the legal basis for this regulatory sandbox was an experimentation clause that already exists in the Passengers Transport Act and in road traffic regulations. And the result of this sandbox and many others on the issue was that it helped us to create the general rules for like on-demand ride-sharing business models. And with the amendment of the Passengers Transport Act, then in 2021, we now allow regular operations of ride pooling and on-demand transport, and even faster, from my opinion, than we would have done this without the experience that we've gathered in regulatory sandboxes. I've also brought one well-designed experimentation clause, but for time reasons, I will skip that. I want to just stress that, from my opinion, one of the most important elements of experimentation clauses is that there should be some kind of obligation for evaluation and data collection. And this is also within this experimentation clauses from the autonomous driving regulation. I don't want to go into details now. So what do we do and what do we plan? If we look into practical experiences, we see that a lot of innovation in Germany takes place in areas where we have experimentation clauses already. So there we are on the front of implementing innovation in Germany, but we see that there are too little of those experimentation clauses in law on the one hand, and also that we are that existing experimentation clauses are poorly used so far, and that there's a huge degree of legal uncertainty and also information deficits. And on the basis of this knowledge, we drew up a regulatory sandbox strategy, which consists of 3 pillars. And I only want to briefly touch the 2 pillars on the right side. They aim to eliminate information deficits, legal uncertainties. They are meant to provide context and generate awareness for the topic. So we have in the Regulatory Sandbox Innovation Prize, we published a handbook for regulatory sandbox, so how to conduct regulatory sandboxes. We have a network and so on. More importantly for us today is pillar 1, which summarizes all of our activities which aim at fundamentally improving the legal possibilities for regulatory sandboxes, as well as regulatory learning. So what are we doing with regard to regulatory learning on the national level? So we have, in the past years, especially in the past 1 and 2 years, we have put a number of new experimentation clauses in law on a national level, for example, in autonomous driving, for digital identities, passengers transportation, and so on. We've also formulated a guide for experimentation clauses, for formulating experimentation clauses, which is supposed to provide assistance to lawmakers in the formulation of experimentation clauses. And we have something like an experimentation clause check in the legislative process. So our ministry committed to examine the possible inclusion of experimentation clauses when drawing new laws, and to put all these measures on a more advanced level or a larger scale and a more binding level. We have formulated a proposal on a regulatory sandbox law, which is also now in the coalition treatment. And there are like four measures. The first one is like an article law, which is supposed to put with one step many experimentation clauses to different fields of regulation and innovation. The second one would be to formulate like overarching standards for regular sandboxes in general, like how do we deal with access, how do we deal with evaluation, how do we deal with scaling, how do we deal with time limits, and so on. And also there's going to be a one-stop shop for regulatory sandbox, so guidance, which is providing guidance, and also the transfer of knowledge into legislation. And we want to have a more binding experimentation clause check in legislation. And if I have 30 more seconds, I don't want to miss to mention also the European level. I mentioned the council conclusions already, and on the basis of those council conclusions from 2020, there are a lot of activities on the European level which incorporate regulatory sandbox and experimentation laws. For example, the new Act on Artificial Intelligence, which is negotiated at the moment. There are AI regulatory sandboxes implemented in it, also in the blockchain regulation, also in digital identities, renewable energies, and so on. And it's also one of the key instruments in the European Innovation Agenda by the Commission. Okay, this was in a nutshell what we're doing, where we're heading. Thank you for your attention. I'm happy to discuss the issue further.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much, Kai. Just one question. You do not pay for these experiments. You just arrange regulations, right?
Right. We're like the overarching institution. Like we are not conducting sandboxes on our own. So we're providing assistance, and we're taking care of the legal framework, so that on the one hand we provide legal leeway for experimenting, and on the other hand to provide the transfer of knowledge to the ministries when they draft new laws. That's about it, right?
Yeah, thank you very much. Other short questions at the moment? Doesn't look like this is the case. Then we can move on to our last speaker. Let me introduce Jeromin Zettelmeier to you. We are very honored to have him. As a former Director General for Economic Policy at the German Federal Ministry of Economic Affairs, he has extensive knowledge about structural components of policymaking. And this is why we asked him to join us today to help us place the initiatives that we just heard about in the German context, and to analyze whether and how they might be applicable in the German setting. For the regulatory sandboxes, we would love to hear his view on why this could be such a successful program. But first, a few words on his career. Jeromin holds a PhD in economics from the MIT. Between 1994 and 2008, he worked in several departments of the International Monetary Fund. He has published widely on a number of topics before he worked at the European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. He then moved to the German government and was Director General for Economic Policy there since 2014. And as a chief economist, he was responsible for the ministry's economic policy department and was involved with all areas of economic policy. Afterwards, he became a senior fellow at the Peterson Institute for International Economics and later joined the IMF again, this time as deputy director of the Strategy and Policy Review Department. Today, he is the newly appointed director of the economic think tank Bruegel, and we're very happy to have you. So we're happy to have you with this specific analytical task, and I'm giving the floor to you, Jeromin.
Thank you, Regina, for the really nice introduction, and real pleasure to be here. And you know, congratulations, Kai, that you persevered and got this little idea that we developed, I think around 2015 or so, as far as you have. So it's really great. Okay, so basically you know, this was a real treat because you got, you know, three, I guess, philosophically aligned, but completely different perspectives on how one can strengthen evidence-based policy making in kind of real life settings. So we have the science advisor model, which is extremely flexible. It's, as I understand it, about coordination and convening power, about being able to sort of intervene ad hoc in a moment of need, like COVID. It's about direct influence on top political decision-making due to the close integration with the chief executives, the Prime Minister, the Minister of Science, and also I think one aspect that Miriam mentioned was, you know, a potential to actually influence science policy via research institutions. So it's very broad, but it does not necessarily get under the hood of the inner working of the bureaucracy or legislature itself. And so this, of course, is the big strength of the UK's evaluation task force approach. So the objective is precisely to get under that hood to establish systematic policy evaluations in UK government departments. So in that sense, if I understand it correctly, it's really about institution building within the ministerial bureaucracy. And then we heard about the regulatory sandboxes, and they're a completely different animal. So I think with one leg, they are really a bit outside the perimeter of evidence-based policymaking because they are a specific form of innovation policy in Germany. It's a form of making innovation happen, making Germany more innovative. And so that's sort of an objective in itself. Then they do contribute to evidence-based policymaking, but in a specific way that has to do, as I understand it, with regulatory improvements. So it's a specific approach to improving regulation based on experiments, namely the experience gained with, you know, the scope for relaxing regulation in particular settings without completely throwing overboard the purposes of regulation. So it's very specific both in target and method. So I'm not going to ask the question which is best. That would of course be the wrong question. And you know, a better question is how far will these approaches take us if implemented together? And then, you know, because I was asked to do it, the other question is, would they work? The two that are not already practiced in Germany, could they be implemented? So let me answer the second question first, because it's the easier one. So in the of the two models that we heard, the chief science advisor role would be very easy to implement in the German context. We have a broadly analogous office, the Chancellor's office. So we could add a position called, you know, Bundesbeauftragter für Wissenschaft or something like that to the Chancellor's office. And that could be roughly analogous to the way that the chief science advisor's position is defined in the Canadian system. Now, we could do it, but there is perhaps also a sense, and I'm not saying that this would not do good, it probably would do good, but there is maybe also a sense that the agenda that Miriam pushes in in Canada is not too far from what tends to happen in Germany even today. So we have sort of an abundance, maybe even an overabundance of attempts to integrate scientific advice into the workings of policymakers. So there are scientific advisory committees everywhere you look. Every ministry has one. There is a long tradition of assembling expert commissions for just about everything. This is how reforms get done in part or structured in Germany. You had the Hartz Commission. When I was there, we had a commission on stimulating investment. Now there's supposed to be a commission that looks about how the energy crisis can be solved in particular ways. So a little bit of what Miriam does tends to happen in the German system as it is right now. So something like the ETF, I think, would be really much more needed in Germany, but also much harder to implement. And the reason is something that we call in Germany the Ressortprinzip, which is basically autonomy of government ministries that makes the Chancellor's office, by and large, a weaker place, I think, than the Prime Minister's office, particularly, the Prime Minister's office combined with the UK Treasury, as which jointly run the ETF. So the Chancellor's office is primarily sort of a coordination outfit and one that sort of determines the red lines of policy making, but to work from the Prime Minister's office to change the structure of from the Chancellor's office to change the structure of ministries, which is, as I understand it, what you're trying to do in the UK would be very difficult in the German system. Now, this said, there's an alternative, which I'm going to come to in a second. But before I do, allow me to sort of step back a minute, which is to ask, in a sense, what the purpose is of the type of evidence-based policy idea that we have heard today. So, the base objective, of course, is to make decisions that are done partly by bureaucrats, partly by politicians, but I would say mainly by bureaucrats, more evidence-based, right? So bureaucrats and politicians in the baseline model, I think, that we are trying to operate under when we undertake these initiatives are assumed to be basically well-intentioned, so democracy basically works, but they do not always face the right incentives, or in some cases they might just not have the right training to take scientific advice really seriously and embed it in policies. And that's what we're sort of trying to address by changing these structures a bit more systematically. So, if that is this objective, I think the approaches that we have heard, and particularly the ETF approach, really goes a long way, because it's precisely about changing those processes. Now, as it happens, though, there is a new challenge, and one challenge that I think was just not present at the time when the ETF and the chief science advisor position were created, which is a political rejection of evidence-based policymaking per se. And part of that rejection is the rejection of the role of experts. And so, in a way, we are facing a much bigger challenge than the challenge that, Monika Schnitzer and I imagined when we first discussed these things, I think in 2014, at a meeting of the German Verein für Sozialpolitik, the Economists Association, which is how we can foster evidence-based policymaking, not just in the face of, bureaucratic inertia and the political machine not paying enough attention to science, but at a time when the very premise that science and evidence leads to truth is rejected by a large segment of voters and politicians. And the most vivid quote to make that point is this very famous Kellyanne Conway quote about alternative facts, right? So here are the scientists' facts, but then there's these alternative facts which politicians should also pay attention to. Now, it is not coincidental, I think, that both the ETF and the chief science advisors were created, the role of the chief science advisor, were created by enlightened governments that gave a lot of weight to scientific evidence. And, unfortunately, these governments are no longer there. And, check the faces on Miriam's slides, right? I mean, they're no longer there. And it's not just about Trump, right? So, you know, the UK is the country that invented the evidence-based approach, right? This is David Hume, essentially. It's 18th century Enlightenment philosophy. And of course, the UK has for several years now pushed back against some of the principles of that Enlightenment, and particularly the idea that, you know, scientific knowledge and experts and so forth should be driving decisions. Okay, so we have an additional objective or an additional question, which is not just how to create evidence-based decision process, but create them in a way that make them resilient to populism and anti-science politics. And at some level, this is an impossible task. So for those of you that are economists, you know, there's a broad analogy in trying to create independent institutions in some areas of policymaking, such as central banks. And, you know, there's some success story in this, but there is also the fate of supposedly independent central banks when the political going really gets rough. So we have examples from Argentina, from Hungary. And so, you know, when it gets rough, they just get swept away. Having said that, also recall the fact that independent central banks have been resilient elsewhere up to a point. So it is kind of shows the limits of this model, but also that the model can succeed up to a point. So what's the answer then to how to go about giving evidence-based approaches a more robust foundation? So as a general principle, you know, make it as deep in an institutional sense as you possibly can. And so, you know, for me, sort of the words task force or advisor are the wrong words, right? I mean, both suggest that these can be ephemeral phenomena. Now, how do we make them less ephemeral? So I think actually, there was a question, right, by the very first Canadian the person who asked the first question after the initial statement from the science advisor, and that is, you know, hopefully if these functions have been around for a while, they become part of the political culture, and so they're harder to remove. That there's another idea, however, which I want to push here, which is maybe we should give the legislature, rather than just the bureaucracy, ownership over these evidence-based policy institutions or processes. In that case, we could also have kill a second bird with the same stone, which is they could have an even broader mandate than just the ETF, right? The ETF is about essentially ensuring that government money is well spent, right? So this is about programs. It is not, in my understanding, and, you know, correct me if I'm wrong, Miriam, it's not about evaluating the causal effects of laws more generally. So what do I have in mind, and why do I think might this work particularly in the German system? Well, we already have an institution like that. So we have a very small independent institution. It's called the Normenkontrollrat. It's the institution that is supposed to control the norms. And what they do, so they come from, I think, the second Merkel government, or maybe the first Merkel government, is they check the so-called bureaucracy costs of laws. So in other words, they're supposed to be there to make sure that the unintended consequences of laws, so those that maybe were not on the mind of policymakers when they came up with the law, are contained, in particular in imposing costs on execution costs, bureaucracy costs on the economy. Well, I mean, maybe we should expand the scope of an institution like that to make sure not just that laws don't have bad unintended consequences, but maybe we should make sure that they actually reach their intended consequences. And so, you know, the gold standard, I think, would be something that's, I think, very close to what Miriam said about the ETF, which is to have a group of evaluation experts that collaborates with the designers of that law, who are typically bureaucrats in the ministries, to ensure that they're designed and implemented in a way that makes them evaluation friendly. So it's exactly what you're trying to do, Miriam. You formulate a theory of change, but with respect to laws, you determine ex ante how you're going to test that theory of change down the road. And, you know, ideally, you try to embed an experimental design in the rollout of every law, right? So what am I thinking of? Well, I'm thinking of myself when I showed up in Germany 3 months late into the new government. And, they were about to roll out the minimum wage. And I, along with many other economists, we were sort of sympathetic to the minimum wage. I wouldn't have got my job had I not been sympathetic to the minimum wage, but I also had second thoughts, right? I thought this could be really harmful for some of the Eastern German states, the Eastern states. And so, there was a moment of about a week where I actually tried to persuade my minister to stagger the implementation, right? To have essentially embed an experimental design in the way we roll out the law, so that simply by staggering the rollout, we could identify causal effects of the law. In the end, it didn't happen, but coincidentally, some states went first anyway, so we got a little bit of that, and it made it actually fairly easy to evaluate the law. But it was by coincidence, not by purpose. So if you did that, you could embed it in a process where the independent body reports the results back to Parliament. You make it transparent, just like Miriam said. And possibly you would have sunset clauses that envisage that extensions or revisions of the law have to be informed by the insights of such an evaluation. So that's sort of my dream for Germany. And let me stop here.
Thank you very much, Jeromine, for this analysis and for these constructive proposals on how to move on. Since you addressed our colleagues, I would like to give Mona and Miriam the opportunity to respond if they like, if they have an answer on the issues that you brought up, and that you said, for example, that these structures are too ephemeral and may be overwritten if there is a time of crisis, or maybe if not such a highly reputable person is running the science advisory position. Mona, what do you have comments on these issues?
Yes, I think it's true that, this is something that I think about a lot, about how, to make sure that the position does not change, or the structure does not end with a new government. And of course, one tends to think of legislating, for example, the position, enshrining it in legislation. But if I take the example of the United States, where there is a director of OSTP that is, has to appear even before Senate and so on, it's the president has a lot of leeway. They can wait for 2-3 years, which is, what happened with the previous president before they appoint someone. So of course, there's always a fragility in terms of the political will. Perhaps the issue about where the position resides, whether it's in legislation or with the executive branch, is one that is actually very interesting, and one that continues to generate debate in Canada. And the different parties have different views on this. We do have, for example, a budget officer that reports to Parliament. So they have more of an evaluation role, if you want. And I think that having a science officer, perhaps, that reports to the legislation is not a bad idea. But my view was, before you start controlling things, you have to put in place a system, at least, by which people are expected to function before you can provide evaluation and so on. So in a way, one role is not mutually exclusive with the other one. And I believe actually there is virtue in bringing them together. I think it's going to be a challenge with the civil service, the bureaucracy, if you want. Not because necessarily they're opposed to change and evaluation, but I think that evaluation always has a very scary connotation. I mean, as scientists, we're constantly evaluated. We're evaluated if we submit a grant proposal, if we submit a manuscript, if we give a talk, we're challenged on our conclusions. and perhaps it may not be the same everywhere around the world, but certainly in North America and in Canada, the notion that, you know, evaluation becomes very personal, and people worry about their jobs, they worry about their compensations and so on. So it doesn't have this constructive element that perhaps in academia we're more used to thinking of and living by.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much. Miriam, do you want to respond, or are you fine?
I'll just respond very, very briefly, because as Mona said, it's obviously something that goes through everyone's mind. And I think it will never go away, given the civil service kind of sits in parallel to whatever political party is in power at any point. What I always say to civil servants we advise is that actually I think evaluation is this great lever. And that if you run a robust evaluation, you put the findings in the public realm, it's incredibly difficult for a minister or whoever to just scrap that program, because you've got the evidence there that says it's working, and we know it's working. It doesn't matter if it aligns to your political agenda or not. And it doesn't matter how focused or not a government is on evidence. Once it's out there in public, it's quite hard. What I want to change is to bring the public a bit with us, where we're going to get, and like Jeremy mentioned that briefly, where like there's this hesitance towards experts now, for one reason or another. But what we've seen in the UK a lot is there was like a very controversial policy on the Uganda migration, for example, and there was a public outcry to say, like, what is this about? That doesn't seem right. And where is the evidence that this is the way to do it? And I'd like to get the public to actually get to that stage where people are starting to question, why are we doing that kind of policy? And there's been really, really interesting RCTs around like this evaluation literacy, and starting like to question the claims that politicians make in public around data and evidence a bit more. And getting to the ephemeral point, it's an interesting one. And like when I applied for this job, I actually thought exactly the same. Might be out of a job relatively soon. But my point is that I think you want quite an agile team, because the evaluation task force is not doing the evaluation. The evaluation task force is kind of being the catalyst that you put into a department to bring the idea and to really like flourish the idea of the usefulness of evidence and embedding that into departmental structure. So I would even argue that ideally, if the ETF does its job, it should become redundant in the long term, because we're getting to a business as usual approach in departments, so you don't need that central government unit anymore to drive that. Having said that, the nudge unit started as a task force. It had a 3-year sunset clause, and I think like 15 years later, they're still around as a social enterprise. So these things tend to stick around.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you very much, Miriam. Okay, let's open the floor to additional questions. Herr Hilscher, you have your hand up first. Please go ahead.
Thank you so much. A quick reply, or rather a question to Jeremy's suggestion to, for example, giving some evaluation power and to the Normenkontrollrat. I've seen there some guys from Normenkontrollrat in the meeting as well. So we can discuss that. The question would be like, how can we, or who is going to implement that? So this is an issue that we're struggling a long time. I should say it's my own opinion that I'm stating now, not the one of the ministry. And I mean, we have the obligation to run ex ante and ex post evaluations in Germany. So the problem is that it's done by the guys who are drafting the laws decentrally. So there's a central, but we are already struggling getting central solutions within the ministry. In our ministry, we have done that, like some support unit with regard to subsidy programs, but it's hard to convince the people in charge in the ministry to do that and give the resources to do that. So it's even harder to do that across the ministry. So what's the way to implement that? Because I like the idea, of course, but how do we get to that point in Germany?
You have a quick answer, Jeromin?
Well, I'm sort of assuming the can opener, right? Like a good economist. So I'm assuming that there is a law that empowers a suitably expanded, redesigned Normenkontrollrat to work with the ministry that is authoring legislation to make sure that the effects of the legislation are testable in some way, right? So that would be a joint task, but of course the Normenkontrollrat would have the independence to make sure that this is done correctly. By the way, I think the resistance of bureaucrats to evaluation, which you're describing, and which I very much remember when I was there, is particularly on programs that involve subsidies, right? Those give bureaucrats power and control, so they don't like them to be cut. But I think when we're talking about proposals that are about, legislation that has to do with regulation, competition law, pension laws, things that would in the German Ministry of Economic Affairs would be more driven by Department 1 than the subsidy doling out departments. I think that the bureaucrats actually would love this. They would be very supportive of this. And then the question, who does the evaluation? Well, an independent third party, right? So the university, a firm, you do a public procurement, then to actually carry out the evaluation. So this would be neither the ministry nor the Normenkontrollrat.
Okay, thank you. There's the pathway described. Monica, you have a question.
Yes, thanks to all the speakers for these extremely inspiring contributions. I would have a question for Miriam. So the 2 points I noted down here is you mentioned objectives are important, and I wonder, how do you make sure that they are objectives? My understanding is sometimes you see a law that wants to achieve something, but describes it in such terms that it's not easy to find criteria that help you to answer whether these criteria or the objectives are actually met. And then you mentioned training of ministers and senior civil servants. How do you make sure that they participate? Is that a top-down approach? Are they forced to? How are they persuaded to actually take part in such training?
Very good questions. Shall I answer now? Sorry.
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. On the objective side, so I would never claim to be an expert in every single law that gets published and discussed across the UK government. So we do rely quite a lot on the expertise within departments, or when necessary, we draw in subject level expertise from the wider What Works network. And I think identifying objectives is tricky, because you always have to compromise, and oftentimes you probably can't measure what you're exactly looking forward to, or it would be incredibly expensive to collate that information. So there is a bit of a compromise to be made in regards to what is measurable and what is actually a meaningful objective for an evaluation. Nevertheless, I'd rather have that discussion, because a lot of times there's still that's where normally the measurement of an objective ends. Oh, we don't have that data, let's discard it. Or we've got a really adjacent outcome measurement here, so let's use that, and it really doesn't work because it's not representative or it's biased, etc. So for me, it's not necessarily about getting 100% the right objective every single time. It's about being ambitious in what is available, what is feasible, what is robust, and then getting that kind of codified in a theory of change, in a log frame where you kind of look at the indicators, etc., and then you find the method accordingly. In regards to training, it is a top-down approach, because as you can really imagine, very few senior civil servants, junior ministers are aware enough of the importance of evaluation for their work at the moment. So it is part of the mandatory core curriculum for junior ministers. As I said, we're trialing it for the first time now, so we haven't done it before. But there's a really interesting RCT, and I can put the link in the chat, from Pakistan, where they've done econometrics training with junior ministers, which is far more extensive than what we are doing. We're basically doing a 2-hour session only. And in Pakistan, they basically went on a course. They had to write an econometrics paper, and then they kind of tracked long-term benefits of that, which is obviously a dream, but not always feasible in all our governments. But yeah, to answer the question, it's a top-down approach. For senior civil servants, it's a mix. So I think because there is now a performance marker in the annual reviews that kind of looks at, okay, what is the evaluation rec rating for your department? There is more of a self-selection bias now that is obviously slightly enforced, but senior civil servants are coming forward more to learn about evaluation now.
Thank you. Claudia Buch, do you still have your question? Yeah, please go ahead.
Yes, I still have my question, but I'm not sure how easy it is to answer in just a couple of minutes or sentences. So first of all, I mean, great presentations, very, very useful, very informative. So my question is really about if you consider what we're discussing right now in Germany, in Europe, and many other countries, it's really about structural change in our economies, becoming less dependent on energy imports. Maybe there's also more structural change ongoing, and I could imagine that many people say, well, this is it's harder to do evidence-based policy if you're in a time of, you know, structural change, or the German word Zeitenwende. On the contrary, you could also argue, well, this is precisely where you have to do more evidence-based policy and understand what you're doing, and set up the right programs and evaluate them. So can you say something, according to your experience, what was the moment when it became feasible to do more evidence-based policy? Was it when everything was business as usual, or was it also in a period where there was more change and more need to really understand what's happening, how effective measures are? Thank you.
Thank you. Who wants to start? When did your initiatives become possible? Mona, please go ahead.
Well, you know, I would say that when it's business as usual, it's very hard to get change and to get attention, because, like, you know, why sort of bother? Things are going, and there's no problem. So in fact, moments of when there is a determination for change, it's the perfect moment. Of course, in terms of crisis, it's, you know, it's easier also, but everything is sort of temporary, if you want. And then when the crisis is over, then people tend to want to go back to the usual. So I would say that, if, you know, when we're contemplating change because of necessity, and the climate agenda in many countries are actually, you know, perfect moments and opportunities that need to be seized, because it's so complex, and actually you require proper analysis of alternatives and you know, what's known, and potential consequences, potential unintended consequences on other sectors. So I think this is, in my view at least, it's a perfect opportunity, because people are already, you know, considering and contemplating analysis and change.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Kai, do you have a story about how your sandboxes came into being?
Maybe I wanted to answer Ms. Buch's question with regard to how do we go in times of Zeitenwende with evidence-based policy, away from regulatory sandboxes, because what we see, like, we are in charge of all the support programs for companies and so on, and in such times programs are developed like over the weekend in 2 or 3 days. So it's hard to have like a centralized unit which is in charge of running the ex ante evaluation to know how it's going to be impacted. So and that's why it's also important to have like the right people on board in the ministries who have an expertise also on knowledge on the impact of programs, who can read empirical evidence and can react pretty fast. So the kinds of quick response to crisis is also an argument in favor of a decentralized approach where we have expertise, knowledge, and training in the ministries.
Is it realistic that in times of crisis you have these evidence bases? Jeromin.
So the sandbox approach was developed because of an acute sense in the Ministry of Economic Affairs that, particularly in the area of autonomous driving, China, the US, Israel would beat the hell out of the Europeans. So it was completely out of a sense of crisis that this was developed, but it was not an acute crisis. It was a sense of impending doom. And I think that anything in Germany is driven by a sense of impending doom. And so in that sense, I'm a bit optimistic that we're going to come out of the latest crisis pretty well.
So the key motivation to change in Germany is impending doom. That's
or impending or actual failure, right? Impending or actual failure. I think the Sandboxes was an attempt to say, how can we as a society become more innovative, given that we have this predilection for extremely risk-averse regulatory frameworks. And so we invented Sandboxes as a sort of as the equivalent of a special economic zone for experimentation. And by the way, the regulatory sandboxes is a misnomer or a wrong translation, because the German concept is Reallabore. So the sandbox is not about regulation. The sandbox is the innovation experiment, right? That you create a sandbox for that innovation experiment, which is outside the normal regulatory perimeter. Well, in a broad sense, it's inside the regulatory perimeter. That's the whole point of the legal change that Kai is pushing, to his great credit. But it's sort of within a meta regulatory perimeter, but you give it, you give more deference to innovation, and that was the idea. And of course, that idea continues to be very powerful. No, I mean, that issue has not gone away in the last few years. It's become more acute, if anything.
Thank you.
Thanks. Are there additional questions from the audience?
Yes.
Yes, please talk.
Yes, I have a question for Miriam. I noticed that there were a couple of stats in your presentation, or a couple of things in your presentation that were quite interesting. The first one was the whole 8% thing, that only 8% of the programs were being evaluated properly. And then you also pointed out that the Cameron government came in with a different approach. As you probably know, they ended up doing a lot of austerity. So I was wondering, how did that impact your ability to evaluate? And how do you keep going forward and trying to do your job effectively under such pressure, if it's even possible?
Brilliant, thank you. Yeah, so the 8% number is derived from an audit that the Prime Minister's Implementation Unit has conducted. So, and it's only for the major project portfolio, which is overseen by something called the Infrastructure Project Authority. But those are all the projects that are basically feeding into the Prime Minister's big goals. And yeah, it was quite shocking to see that when you look at robust evaluation, obviously there's a bit of subjective evaluation and assessment here. So what do we consider robust? But for us, that meant ideally having a causal effect, or at least we said in the end, a matched pre-post, even though that had its own bias. But yeah, only 8% of projects have that, and that in and by itself is shocking. In regards to the austerity question, to be honest, I mean, I'm not old enough to have been in the government in 2010, but to be honest, ever since I've been working in government, and even before that in the public sector, we've always lived in areas of austerity. And to be honest, we'll always have politics that have to deal with scarce resources. So there's always an argument for like, oh, do we have the money for this? But that's exactly where evaluation should be coming in. And the UK government has a really strong approach for evaluation budgets. So we're saying up to 10% of a project should be spent on evaluation. And oftentimes that's a bit lower, and sometimes there needs to be a negotiation on what is the right percentage point. But especially in times of scarce resources, we need to know that projects are being funded, that projects are being evaluated, so they show us the additionality and the value for money. The tricky bit here is for evaluation, not just to deliver at the end of a project cycle, because that doesn't help us, but to give and kind of bridging the realpolitik discussion here, you want intermediate insights as well. They can show you, oh, are we on the right track here? Can we amend? Should we modify, etc.? And if that is done properly, I think there's a real interest and appetite, even in time of austerity, for evaluation that can deliver insights to kind of help with that budgeting.
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much. If we check the time, it's already up. And this brings me to ask Monika Schnitzer to give us the closing speech, the closing statement for our workshop.
Okay, thanks a lot, Regina. So let me start by thanking everybody for sharing your experience, your knowledge. We're extremely grateful to hear about your examples, to hear about your experiences, and learn from this how potentially we can move this forward in Germany. Let me give you my take on what we learned today, or what I learned, let's put it like that. I learned from Miriam that it's really helpful if you have an enlightened government that uses a top-down approach. So once you have this opportunity, take it and move it from there. And let's hope we have this. From Kai, I learned that okay, ex post implementation evaluation is great when you can do it, but sometimes you need to move quickly, and then learning before actually rolling out something on a big scale. It's great if you can use this sandbox approach, and I would really like to see much more of that in many more realms. Jeremy, what I learned from you is yeah, it's actually not straightforward to move from here if we have a sense of potentially even reversal of back from enlightened government, perhaps towards a situation where people are not willing, not happy to hear, to listen to experts, and you were calling for a more enshrined policy in legislation, giving legislation ownership. So if the legislators want to see that what they vote on is actually then effective, they should also be giving the ownership to see that these laws are actually implemented the way that they intended them to be. Now, when it comes to this political rejection of experts, I think we learned from Mona what this entails for experts. Because the one thing that I took from my sense that the most important thing that I took from your presentation was that as an expert, when you work for the government in your role is really to ask tough questions, not to take a stance. So not to take sides, but really to challenge the experts that are presenting their evidence. And in order to be trusted, or let's put it again, in order to be taken seriously, to be heard, you need to be trusted. So you need to respect, you need to be trusted. And for this, you need clarity, honesty, integrity. I think that is something that I do find extremely important for all the experts, and many are sitting here now also as experts doing or trying to give policy advice. So I think that's really invaluable to make sure that we act with integrity and honesty and are not taking sides, pushing our own agenda, because otherwise we're not likely to be heard. So with this, I would again like to thank everybody for participating. And in the end, I would also like to invite all the participants here that are present to tell us by email or other means if they've heard about initiatives of evidence-based policymaking. Please bring this to our attention so that we perhaps can include them in following workshops. And I would also like to invite you already for the next installment of our series that will be about policy evaluation and knowledge brokers. We are planning to do this event at the beginning of next year, and I hope to see many of you again next year. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, and have a nice afternoon or day. Bye-bye.
Thank you.